June 1919, inside the Grand Palace of Versailles, where empires once rose to glory, the leaders of Europe gathered to sign a document they believed would bring peace. But instead, it planted the seeds of an even greater disaster, a treaty praised for ending all wars, yet it would plunge the world back into darkness just 2 decades later. Today, we turn back time to uncover why the Treaty of Versailles, meant to ensure peace, became the spark that ignited World War II. June 1914, a shot rang out in Sarajevo and sent the world tumbling into chaos. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary triggered a chain reaction that drew in the great powers of Europe, who had long built up alliances, rivalries, and suspicions. What followed was 4 years of slaughter. The armies of Europe mobilized, trenches stretched across the Western Front, the skies filled with new machines of war, and empires tottered. By the time of the armistice on 11th November 1918, more than 65 million men had served in uniform, with at least 8.5 million military dead, and another 6.6 million or more civilians perishing in the conflict's brutal wake. The land itself was ravaged. Farmland turned into morass, towns destroyed, factories silenced, and societies left traumatized. In those final months of the war, and in the immediate aftermath, there was a profound yearning for peace. The tide of public opinion across many nations demanded that the conflict be the war to end all wars. Into this mood stepped Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, who in January 1918 unveiled his famous 14 points. These principles advocated open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, self-determination of nations, disarmament, and, most significantly, the creation of a body to safeguard world peace, the League of Nations. Wilson's vision sought to reorder a Europe fractured by war and prevent future catastrophe. But just as war drew on from alliance to alliance, so too did peace negotiations become tangled in competing goals. The victors, above all France and Britain, had suffered immensely, both in lives lost and in devastation. They sought to ensure Germany not only accepted defeat, but would never again threaten the continent. Wilson, though committed to idealism, found his 14 points sidelined by the harder demands of his allies. In January 1919, the Paris Peace Conference opened at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris. Delegates from more than 27 nations gathered, but Germany was excluded from the discussions themselves. The Allies formed a Council of 10, later the Council of 5, composed of Britain, France, the United States, Italy, and Japan, to determine the shape of the settlement. Germany was presented with a fait accompli: take the terms or face renewed war. France, under Georges Clemenceau, was blunt in its demands. French losses had been almost unimaginable, some 1.3 million soldiers dead, vast swaths of its industrial northeast, the so-called Zone Rouge, devastated, mines flooded, railways destroyed. Clemenceau insisted Germany must be weakened territorially, militarily, and economically to protect France's future. As he told Wilson, "America is far away. We are not." Britain, led by David Lloyd George, occupied a more ambivalent position, wanting Germany to pay, but aware that a completely collapsed German economy might harm British trade. Germany, humiliated and dismayed, complained it was being forced to sign a diktat, a dictated peace. On 7th May 1919, when first handed the draft of the treaty, the German Foreign Minister Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau protested. We sense the full force of hatred that confronts us here. You demand from us to confess we were the only guilty party of war. Such a confession in my mouth would be a lie. On 28 June 1919, the 5th anniversary of the Sarajevo assassination, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in the famous Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles in France. The symbolism was powerful. The same site where in 1871 the German Empire had been proclaimed now served as the scene of its compelled submission. The treaty took effect on 10th January 1920 after ratification by Germany and the principal Allied powers. From its opening pages, the document made Germany accept far-reaching obligations. Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, placed responsibility for the war squarely on Germany and its allies. The country was therefore liable for all the loss and damage caused by the conflict. Territories would be lost, the military reduced, and massive reparations imposed. Thus the hope for a peace built on Wilson's ideals collided with the reality of Victor's demands. The world moved from the guns of 1914 to 18 to mandatory signatures and rigid articles in Versailles, and as we shall see, the consequences would reverberate far beyond 1919. The Treaty of Versailles was not merely a peace settlement. It was a declaration of punishment. The Allied powers, exhausted yet triumphant, wanted Germany to pay for the devastation of 4 years of war. The result was a document of 440 articles, divided into 15 parts, that reshaped Europe and left Germany crippled in almost every sphere. Territorial losses. Germany was stripped of roughly 13% of its land and 10% of its population. To the west, the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France, lands that Germany had taken in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War. To the north, small border districts were handed to Belgium and Denmark. In the east, the consequences were even greater. Large portions of Prussia and Posen were transferred to the newly reborn nation of Poland, creating what became known as the Polish Corridor, a strip of land that gave Poland access to the Baltic Sea, but cut East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. The port city of Danzig, today's Gdansk, was declared a free city under the protection of the League of Nations. To many Germans, this partitioning of their homeland was intolerable. They called it the carving of the fatherland. Germany also lost all its overseas colonies in Africa and the Pacific. These territories, including Togoland, Cameroon, German East Africa, and German Southwest Africa, were turned into League of Nations mandates handed to Allied powers to administer. Though the rhetoric spoke of trusteeship, in reality it was a redistribution of empire. Disarmament and military restrictions. The German military, once the pride of the empire, was gutted. The treaty limited the German army to 100,000 men to be used solely for internal security. Conscription was abolished, and the general staff, long seen as the brain of Prussian militarism, was dissolved. The country was forbidden to possess tanks, heavy artillery, military aircraft, or submarines. The German Navy was reduced to a handful of small coastal defense ships. Even the production of weapons was strictly controlled. The western region of the Rhineland, bordering France, was to be completely demilitarized and occupied by Allied troops for 15 years. For a nation whose culture was steeped in military tradition, these clauses were more than disarmament. They were humiliation. "Our sword is broken," lamented one officer. "Our honor has been taken. Economic burden. Reparations." Perhaps the most punishing blow came in the form of reparations. Article 232 established that Germany must compensate the Allies for all damage done to the civilian population of the Allied and associated powers. In 1921, the amount was fixed at 269 billion gold marks, the equivalent of about 37 billion US dollars at the time. The sum was astronomical, more than Germany's total national output for several years. Payments were to be made in money, coal, ships, machinery, and even livestock. To ensure compliance, the Allies took control of the Saar Basin's coal mines for 15 years and permitted France to exploit their output. The German economy, already in ruins from the war, now staggered under a debt that seemed impossible to pay. Political clauses and the war guilt, but nothing angered Germans more than Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. It declared that Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. To many Germans, both politicians and ordinary citizens, this was an unbearable insult. They admitted defeat, but not sole responsibility. In their eyes, every major power had played a role in the slide toward war in 1914. The clause turned national mourning into collective shame. Even before the ink dried, German newspapers raged against the Schandfrieden, the shameful peace. The government that signed the treaty was branded traitorous. Members of the delegation were spat on in the streets. The fledgling Weimar Republic, barely born, began its life under a cloud of resentment. The Allied powers' perspectives. To the Allied nations, the treaty seemed a compromise between vengeance and practicality. France's Clemenceau wanted Germany permanently broken, Britain's Lloyd George wanted a Germany strong enough to trade, and Wilson still hoped for a moral peace anchored by his League of Nations. Clemenceau defended the treaty with icy determination. "This is not vengeance," he said. "It is justice." But across the Atlantic, even before the treaty was ratified, American senators recoiled. They feared being drawn into European entanglements through the League. In March 1920, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States signed separate peace agreements with Germany and Austria later that year. The German reaction and the birth of resentment. In Germany, the reaction was swift and bitter. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff spread the stab-in-the-back myth, claiming that the German army had not truly been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by politicians, socialists, and Jews on the home front. This narrative, though false, gave millions of disillusioned citizens an explanation that was easier to bear than defeat. The myth of betrayal and the humiliation of Versailles became twin pillars of resentment that extremists would later exploit. Nationalists vowed to tear up the treaty. Veterans groups formed paramilitary organizations like the Freikorps, promising revenge against communists at home and enemies abroad. Meanwhile, the economic reality was dire. With limited industrial capacity and crushing reparations, Germany faced shortages of food and raw materials. Inflation surged. The middle class saw their savings evaporate. By the early 1920s, the mark collapsed so completely that people carried banknotes in wheelbarrows to buy a loaf of bread. Across Europe, the promise of Wilson's new diplomacy was fading fast. The League of Nations began its work, but without the participation of the United States, it lacked authority. Borders were redrawn. New nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia appeared on the map. Yet millions of ethnic minorities found themselves under new rulers, planting the seeds of future conflict. The Treaty of Versailles had sought to close the chapter on the Great War. Instead, it left open wounds that would fester for a generation. As British economist John Maynard Keynes, a delegate to the conference, wrote in his famous book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, "If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp. Nothing can then delay for very long that final civil war between the forces of reaction and the despairing convulsions of revolution." His words would prove prophetic. The ink on the Treaty of Versailles had barely dried when its effects began to tear through Germany like a slow-moving storm. For the victors, the treaty was supposed to bring stability. For the defeated, it became a daily reminder of humiliation, hunger, and despair. The ink on the Treaty of Versailles had barely dried when its effects began to tear through Germany like a slow-moving storm. For the victors, the treaty was supposed to bring stability. For the defeated, it became a daily reminder of humiliation, hunger, and despair. The economic freefall. By 1920, Germany's economy was collapsing under the weight of reparations and industrial loss. The Ruhr, the nation's industrial heart, had been stripped of coal, steel, and machinery as payments to France and Belgium. Entire factories stood idle. Veterans returned home to no jobs, no pensions, and no honor. In 1921, the Allied Reparations Commission set the final figure at 132 billion gold marks. Less than the initial proposal, but still impossibly high. Payments were to be made over decades, but Germany was already broke. To keep the fragile Weimar Republic functioning, the government resorted to printing money, a desperate measure that spiraled into hyperinflation. By the summer of 1923, prices were doubling every few days. Housewives burned banknotes for fuel. Children played with stacks of worthless paper money. Workers were paid twice a day because wages lost value between morning and afternoon. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 soared to 200 billion marks, so by November 1923, savings disappeared overnight. The middle class, once the backbone of German society, was destroyed. Inflation, wrote one observer, was not a problem of money, but of faith. The German people had lost faith in their government, their economy, and even democracy itself. Political chaos and the stab-in-the-back myth. The Weimar Republic, founded in 1919, was Germany's first attempt at democracy. But it was born in defeat, and that stigma never faded. Its leaders were the same men who had signed the hated Treaty of Versailles. To the radical right, they were traitors, the November criminals. To the left, they were weak and corrupt. Political assassinations became common. Between 1919 and 1923, over 350 politicians were murdered by extremists, most of them right-wing nationalists who escaped punishment. In this chaos, a poisonous idea spread that Germany had not really lost the war militarily, but had been stabbed in the back by Jews, communists, and pacifists at home. The myth was fiction, but it was powerful. The former General Erich Ludendorff and Field Marshal Hindenburg, both eager to preserve their reputations, encouraged it. They claimed the undefeated German army had been betrayed by politicians and civilians. The story gave the defeated nation something to believe in, an excuse for their suffering. The occupation of the Ruhr. In January 1923, when Germany defaulted on reparation payments, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley. Germany's industrial core. The goal was to seize coal and raw materials as payment. The German government responded with a campaign of passive resistance. ordering workers to strike and refusing to cooperate with the occupiers. But this act of defiance worsened the economic crisis. With no production and no tax revenue, the government printed even more money, feeding the flames of hyperinflation. Meanwhile, nationalist militias clashed with communist uprisings across the country. The fragile republic seemed on the brink of civil war. A man named Adolf Hitler. It was during this storm that a little-known Austrian veteran began to rise from obscurity. Adolf Hitler, a former corporal who had served in the Bavarian army, joined a small nationalist group in Munich, the German Workers' Party, in 1919. Gifted with oratory and consumed by hatred of the Versailles Treaty, Hitler quickly became its most visible figure. By 1920, the party renamed itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. In fiery speeches, Hitler promised to restore Germany's pride, tear up the Versailles Treaty, and purge the nation of its internal enemies. His message resonated deeply with those humiliated by defeat and ruined by inflation. Germany, he declared, will rise again not through gold, but through blood. The Beer Hall Putsch. On the evening of November 8, 1923, Hitler made his first bid for power. Inspired by Mussolini's fascist march on Rome, he and his followers stormed a Munich beer hall where local officials were meeting. Waving pistols, Hitler proclaimed a national revolution and declared a new government. But the coup failed within hours. Police opened fire. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. At his trial, however, he transformed the courtroom into a stage. "Yes, I committed treason," he told the judges, "but against a government that betrayed its people." Newspapers across Germany printed his words. He was sentenced to 5 years, but served only 9 months, in comfortable confinement, during which he wrote Mein Kampf, laying out his ideology of nationalism, racial purity, and revenge against the Versailles powers. By the time he left prison in December 1924, inflation had been brought under control, and the economy was stabilizing. But Hitler's name was now known across Germany. A brief calm, the Dawes Plan, and temporary recovery. In 1924, the Allied nations, alarmed by Germany's collapse, introduced the Dawes Plan, named after American banker Charles G. Dawes. The plan restructured reparations and introduced American loans to help rebuild the German economy. Foreign investment flowed in, factories reopened, and the new currency, the Rentenmark, restored stability. Berlin cafes filled again with music, laughter, and art. Historians would later call it the Golden Twenties. Yet beneath the surface, resentment remained. To nationalists, the Dawes Plan was not salvation, but servitude, a deal that bound Germany's fate to foreign bankers. To ordinary Germans, prosperity felt fragile, temporary, dependent on outsiders. And in truth, it was the quiet before the storm. By the end of the decade, the worst seemed over. Germany joined the League of Nations in 1926 and signed treaties with France and Belgium at Locarno, promising peaceful borders. The world began to believe that reconciliation was possible, but the scars of Versailles had not healed, only been covered. The resentment, the humiliation, the myths of betrayal, all lay dormant, waiting for a new crisis to bring them roaring back. That crisis came in 1929, when the Great Depression struck. Foreign loans evaporated, factories closed, unemployment soared. Within 2 years, 6 million Germans were jobless. The fragile Weimar democracy collapsed under the weight of despair, and as the people searched once more for someone to blame, the man who had once shouted in Munich beer halls returned to the stage, promising revenge, revival, and redemption. Adolf Hitler's rise would not have been possible without the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty had broken Germany's body, but it had also poisoned its soul. By the early 1930s, the Treaty of Versailles, once hailed as the foundation for lasting peace, had become a symbol of everything wrong with the world. In Germany, it was despised not only as a document of defeat, but as a national curse. And now, amid the ruins of the Great Depression, one man was ready to use that hatred as his weapon. Germany, in ruins once more. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves across the globe. For Germany, whose fragile recovery had depended on American loans under the Dawes Plan, it was catastrophic. Factories closed, banks failed, and unemployment soared to unprecedented levels. 6 million jobless by 1932. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Families scavenged for coal to heat their homes. The promise of democracy, already fragile, disintegrated into bitterness. In this chaos, extremist parties flourished. On one side stood the communists, vowing revolution. On the other, the National Socialists, promising order, pride, and vengeance. Their leader, Adolf Hitler, now a master orator and political tactician, offered a simple message. Germany's suffering was not fate. It was the result of betrayal and humiliation imposed by Versailles. He declared, "We were made slaves by a piece of shame. But we shall rise again, not as beggars, but as masters of our destiny." The road to power. In the elections of 1932, the Nazi Party became the largest in the Reichstag. Fearful of civil unrest, President Paul von Hindenburg, the old field marshal from the Great War, reluctantly appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. Within months, democracy was dead. After a suspicious fire gutted the Reichstag building, Hitler blamed the communists and demanded emergency powers. The Enabling Act, passed in March 1933, gave him authority to rule by decree. The Weimar Republic, born in defeat, was now buried by dictatorship. Hitler wasted no time dismantling the restrictions of Versailles. The disarmament clauses were ignored. Secret rearmament programs began under the guise of civil industries. The Luftwaffe, an air force forbidden by the treaty, was secretly trained in the Soviet Union. By 1935, Hitler made his defiance public. In a rousing speech, he announced the reintroduction of conscription and the expansion of the army to 500,000 men. 5 times the limit allowed. Europe protested, but little else. Britain and France, still scarred by the horrors of the Great War, preferred appeasement to confrontation. The Rhineland. First step toward war. On March 7, 1936, Hitler took his boldest gamble yet. German troops marched into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone that had served as a buffer between France and Germany since 1919. It was a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles and of the Locarno Pact that Germany itself had signed. But Hitler bet correctly that no one would stop him. France, in political turmoil, refused to act without British support. Britain, seeing the move as Germany merely entering its own backyard, did nothing. Hitler later admitted that if the French army had moved in, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs. Instead, his gamble paid off. The German people cheered, and Hitler's popularity soared. The shackles of Versailles were being broken, one by one. The illusion of peace. The late 1930s were marked by dangerous illusions. Many in Britain and France believed that satisfying Germany's demands might preserve peace. After all, hadn't the treaty been too harsh? The British diplomat Neville Henderson wrote, "We must be fair to Germany. She has genuine grievances." Meanwhile, Hitler moved swiftly. In March 1938, German troops crossed the border into Austria in the Anschluss, the unification of the two German-speaking nations. It was forbidden by the treaty, yet once again, there was no resistance. Crowds in Vienna cheered wildly. To them it felt like national restoration. To the world, it was another violation, met with silence. Next came Czechoslovakia, created after the war from the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region with a large ethnic German population. He claimed they were being mistreated and must be returned to the Reich. In September 1938, at the Munich Conference, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier met with Hitler and Italy's Mussolini. They agreed to let Germany take the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further territorial demands. Chamberlain returned to London proclaiming, "I believe it is peace for our time." But peace was already dying. The final betrayal and the end of Versailles. In March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. The world now saw the truth. His ambitions extended far beyond revising the Treaty of Versailles. He wanted domination, not justice. That summer, Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. 1 week later, on September 1st, 1939, German forces stormed across the Polish border. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had begun. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The peace, signed in Versailles 20 years earlier, had shattered. The legacy of Versailles. For many historians, the Treaty of Versailles was not the sole cause of the Second World War, but it was the soil in which the seeds of destruction grew. Its harsh terms humiliated Germany without permanently restraining it. Its economic burdens crippled the nation, yet fueled extremism. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the French general who had commanded Allied forces in 1918, had predicted it at the time. After reading the treaty, he said, "This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years." He was almost exactly right. The war ended in November 1918. The next one began in September 1939, just 20 years and 10 months later. Epilogue: The Long Shadow. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, Europe lay in ruins once more. Tens of millions were dead. And from those ashes, the world finally learned a bitter truth. Peace cannot be built on humiliation. Decades later, Germany would slowly rebuild, both materially and morally. On October 3rd, 2010, it made the final payment of its World War I reparations, 91 years after the Treaty of Versailles was signed. The treaty's legacy remains a warning written in history that vengeance disguised as peace is only the prelude to another war. When peace becomes punishment, wrote one historian, it ceases to be peace at all.